Hello again, everyone. I'm Eric Sperling. Thank you so much for joining All in Education's second season of PACE Sepas. I'd like to welcome today's experts with us. We have Stephanie Parra. She is, of course, the Executive Director at All in Education. We also have Yvonne Delgadillo. She is the Principal at Allied Affordable Housing. And we have Ruger Fontes. He's the owner of Fontes Tax. All right, before we get to the panel, a little bit about All in Education. All in Education is a local nonprofit organization that exists to build an Arizona where all communities have access to opportunity and justice. Now, their work is focused on strengthening the Latino community by closing the representation gap to build power, influence, and authority across Arizona boardrooms and classrooms. Now, through PACE Sepas, All in Education has been working to bridge their advocacy efforts to be inclusive of multiple factors outside of the classroom that are impacting the educational outcomes of students. They're calling these factors the social determinants of education. Now, the focus of PACE Sepas is on having real, thought-provoking conversations like we're going to have today with leaders and community members and identifying solutions to work towards creating meaningful changes in the systems meant to serve our communities. This season, we'll exclusively focus on the issue of poverty, the social determinant of education that, through an analysis, All in Education found was the leading factor that had the greatest negative impact on the welfare of families, communities, students, and schools. So today's conversation, we'll take a look at how access to building generational wealth is a step out of poverty. However, the access to the opportunities and structures to build generational wealth has long been denied for Latino and BIPOC communities. So with that introduction, welcome Stephanie, Yvonne, and Ruger. Let's start this conversation getting to know you guys a little more. Ruger, let's start with you. Tell us a little about yourself and how you're engaged in the work of education when it comes to building generational wealth.
Hello, first off, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, my name is Ruger Fontes. I was born in Nogales, Arizona. Lived there till I was 18 and then came to Phoenix, Arizona, and I've been here pretty much since 1998. I am a CPA, that's a certified public accountant, and most of my days in that field. I have 3 kids and a wife, so I have other stuff on my mind, but when we get into what education is related to me, we deal with educating adults, which is a bit of a unique situation. In our tax practice, people come in, usually in their early 20s when they start to kind of stand on their own 2 feet. And they come in with their first job, right? They got a W-2, they got some earnings, and they really want to know what that entails. They're a little confused why their check's a little smaller than what they thought it would be. They're a little confused why the W-2 is probably a higher number than they got. And we sit them down and we go through the process of learning who, what, when, where, why. And it's fun. We deal with over 1,000 tax returns a year. So I get to be sitting at a table with over 1,000 different families a year, and we get to learn that everybody learns differently. And some people are more advanced than others, but they're all willing to learn, and that's the fun part about me. Now, when it gets to generational wealth, once people are able to stand on their own 2 feet, I always push for that because we know the benefits of that. I fortunately have a voice in their life because I'm their trusted advisor. So I sit down, hey, what are we going to do about generational wealth? And we sit down and we get to how are they going to earn wealth, protect it, grow it, and have it there for their future heirs. So everything we're talking about really makes me excited that hopefully I can contribute today.
Yeah, this will be a great conversation. Yvonne, how about you? A little bit on your background and then your role in educating the community when it comes to generational wealth.
Well, first of all, thank you for also having me here. It's a pleasure to be able to discuss have these conversations. Like Ruger, I'm also from Nogales, and so proud Nogalian. Currently, I'm the principal of an affordable housing development company. But prior to coming with Allied, I actually was the executive director of the Nogales Community Development Corporation, which really focused on building assets within the community and working with low to moderate income families so that they could learn a little bit more about what resources are out there so they can become financially independent. Whether it's families that have been on welfare for years or families that are trying to start their job, trying to find different opportunities, it was always about providing them with the resources that are out there. Whether it was individual development accounts or financial management education, so that they could start building that generational wealth.
Well, you guys are 2 fantastic panelists for today's conversation. Stephanie, help us build the context around the conversation because we're talking about income levels. So talk about demographics in the community that we're talking about here.
Yeah, so we are predominantly, the work that we do at All in Education, we're working inside of Title I schools. And so those are predominantly schools that serve low-income communities, and the impacts of poverty. I mean, this whole conversation around social determinants and what we're doing this season is unpacking the impact of poverty on educational attainment. And so what we believe at All in Ed is that we have to create the conditions for our families, much like you all are doing in your work, create the conditions for them to have access to those wealth building opportunities so that they can break the cycle of poverty that many of them grew up in. We had a parent actually just this week talk about her personal experience as an immigrant and someone who did not have had a lot of barriers and did not have a lot of opportunities, is now thinking differently about her children and the opportunities that they will have access to. And so she is navigating the system in a different way to really be an advocate for her child. And I think so as we are having this conversation, we really want both leaders in the community, but also our parents and caregivers to understand, who do I turn to, and who are the supports and the resources that are available for me and my family so that we can break these cycles of poverty that we grow up in.
Yvonne, Stephanie was just talking about those opportunities there, but what are some of the barriers that you're seeing, especially in your line of work?
I think a lot of times it's mindset. Really? and lack of, I think, not knowing what is out there. Okay. It's they've never had these type of resources at their hand. It's a different culture. For example, when it comes to financial education, it's people who are living day to day. Their paycheck is coming in and it's going out to pay basic bills. Whereas the shift that we're trying to create with financial education, for example, is teaching people how to save. Or as Ruger was mentioning, how can you use your taxes and your tax return to be able to invest in something when sometimes you can't see beyond the bills that you have there. And so it's really trying to shift the mindset to more of building assets so that you can start saving. You don't feel like you always have to hold your head above water.
So Ruger, if mindset is one of these big barriers here, and you were just saying you have these conversations, and when you bring up generational wealth, I'm assuming sometimes maybe a person on the other side of the table doesn't know what that term is. So can you define income versus generational wealth, and then how obviously getting a little more in depth on generational wealth can help close some of those social inequalities that we're seeing? Yeah,
not only do many of them not know what that is, but it's a scary word, especially if you didn't grow up in that arena. So to your first part, income and generational wealth are quite different. Income is, I look at it kind of a snapshot, a short-term thing, what you got paid for the last week of work. You know, the end of the month comes, we get our check, that's our income, which is great. When we're talking about then after that wealth and generational wealth, it's how do we get there? And the first step is managing our income correctly. The make-believe I always say is if we're making hopefully $5,000 a month, to make up a number, at the end of the year we make $60,000. How do we spend less than $60,000? And we do that via budgeting, planning, you know, something that our community is really good at doing, you know, being cognizant of where our money's going out. If we can ever spend 50 and make 60, you know, create that delta, that surplus, that's when our income can slowly start transitioning into wealth. And then from wealth, it goes on from there. Year 2, year 3, it's a slow process. But for the purpose of this conversation, we're getting into generational wealth. That's when over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, our little wealth surplus that I'm talking about every year grows, 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 so that one day, you know, in this make-believe, grandma and grandpa pass away, mom and dad get the money. And then one day, mom and dad can also pass that to their kids. That is generational wealth. Usually going between 3 generations, and the question is, how does that help, you know, get rid of this, right? Our problem of the discrepancy. A lot of the naysayers say, all right, we have 2 kids, kid A and kid B, and they're going to the same school. They have the same teacher. In this make-believe, they're probably not going to the same school, but shouldn't they perform the same? And generational wealth directly says no. And you know, I'm an accountant, so I maybe harp on this a little more than one would, but I was actually viewing some of your show's past episodes, and you guys were talking about how factors outside of the classroom affect. And most of those are really eaten up by poverty as opposed to generational wealth. And just to go through a couple, when we're talking about generational wealth, the people that are benefiting from the income that their grandparents and parents made, they typically have a home, because that's one of the first things that generation passes through. So when you're talking about kids that are classified as homeless, maybe they're bouncing from bed to bed, which is a surprisingly, alarmingly large number. So now you have these same two kids that go to the same school. One kid didn't sleep well, right? And then in generational wealth, that same kid that had a bed, a consistent bed over the past couple of years, he probably had breakfast. And this keeps going, because a kid that didn't have breakfast and didn't sleep, he had to wake up half an hour early to get to the bus. And so I'm laying all these things out, and we're not even to 8 a.m. School hasn't even started yet, right? So we're starting this discrepancy. Now, I'm very conscious when I'm talking about this to just say, well, throw money at the problem. And that's not it. It's about us being cognizant that these two kids at the same schools have very different obstacles. And so part of the purpose of this conversation is so that us, other people in the community, can relay it out to everybody else. Hey, what's going on? There just needs to be more consensus on that. The kid with the family of wealth, good for them, right? We're hoping our kids get into that bucket, but we need to be cognizant of the kids without that wealth and all that they're facing. So I told you I sit down and talk to thousands of people, you know, every year over the last 20 years, so say 20,000 people. I'm allowed to butt into their business, so to speak, and a lot of times they bring their kids with them. Because a lot of these kids that are struggling, they don't have the nanny or anybody else, so there's kids in the room. So I always frame it, and I always tell them, hey, talk to your kids. They're part of this too. They're 10, yeah, they can make their way through Minecraft. They can grasp this. And just not to be a hypocrite, I literally was talking to my kids. I told my kids I was coming on. So we're talking about generational wealth last night, and they get it. They had never heard of it before, because we had never got to that, and I don't want them to hate me for talking like an accountant. but the example I gave them, and it resonated with them, and I think it will resonate throughout the community. I have 3 kids, and their favorite movie is Cars, right? There's a race, you race around the racetrack, right? And I was talking to them about the 2 kids, and I was like, hey, what if they're both in the same race? Who's gonna win? They're like, I don't know. I was like, if the kid that generational wealth started in first place, and the kid out of poverty started last in 10th place, and we got a lap, who's gonna win? You know, kids are smart. They've played Mario Kart before, right? The kid in 10th place that has all these, what may be seen as minor obstacles, has to do so much more work. I'd say an unfair amount of work to get to 9th, 8th, 7th, and the kid in first place has this clear path. So will money fix it? No, you know, it'll help. But us acknowledging that the kid coming out of poverty has that path that's just so much tougher is part of what's going to close the gap. And then hopefully we have time later in the conversation, we'll talk about getting generational wealth, but it's I'd say the biggest deterrent, in agreement with what Allin's saying.
And I love that you brought up our past conversations, because Stephanie and her team did such a great job of identifying that poverty needs to be almost an entire season and even more of conversations because of how many different factors go into that. Stephanie, when we talk about access to education, how does generational wealth, or the lack of generational wealth, impact access to a quality education?
Yeah, I mean, this is, you alluded to it, and I'm so glad that you bring a different perspective to the conversation, but it's all aligned, right? So the way that our system is structured, schools are funded based on local property taxes predominantly, and so when you don't have access to wealth building and asset building that we're having in this conversation, your local tax base is not going to be as high. Therefore, the resources coming into your school are not going to be as high. So when we're talking about kid A and kid B, and then you remove them from the fact that they are in the same school, the ones that are, you know, even just miles apart, North Phoenix versus South Phoenix, Scottsdale versus Phoenix, right? So the asset in the community looks different, and therefore the resources being pumped into our schools are disparate. There's a huge disparity between them. And so this is why the conversation around wealth building and making sure that our communities have access to resources and that they are cognizant of the importance of building those assets is so critical to educational attainment, because without resources and supports, like, kids will struggle even more. And so yes, we want to make sure that our schools are adequately funded, but I think even more important is that our schools are equitably funded, that the kid that is in 10th place has even a shot of getting to first place.
Speaking of disparities, Yvonne, we've heard about the wage gaps between racial and ethnic groups, but the other layer is the wage gap between genders here. Let's talk about how Latino and BIPOC women embrace being in leadership and staying motivated to grow professionally, knowing about this existing wage gap.
You know, ironically enough, this has been a conversation that we were having. There's a group that I'm in within the affordable housing arena, and being in the development world, it's mostly men. And I think at the end of the day, when it comes to women, it's about learning how to use our voices and not constantly apologizing for things, but really asking and demanding that we have the same level of respect, consideration. But I think when you add not only that you're in the 10th place, but the fact that you are a woman and you're already at a disadvantage, or it might be similar, it's a lot more challenging. But I think at the end of the day, it's not only having access to some of the wealth building tools, but empowerment opportunities. And it comes a lot through education and through schools. Sometimes you don't get that level of confidence or that training or that direction from family because they didn't learn it from themselves when we're talking about that generational wealth. So the school becomes your #1 place where you get it. And when we were talking about equity, it's really, if you see that there's not enough wealth that's being built in a community versus another one, there's more that needs to be invested because they need more attention. They don't have it at home. And I think for women, it's more about really finding that confidence in addition to the other tools of what's out there. Because a lot of times I feel like we're timid about asking for things. Like if in my position, someone may be getting paid $50,000 more, or I was actually talking to a friend who's in the technology field, and she was getting paid $100,000 less than her male counterpart. And she's a Latina, and she just learned English, but she works even harder. And so, but I think at the end, it's about finding our voice and having those resources within education, within the communities we work and live in, that we can tap into.
So we've been talking about these barriers. Ruger, let's talk about building generational wealth. And you've given some examples previously in this discussion. You know, sometimes a family might sit down with you and they're struggling to put food on the table, and then you bring up a conversation on generational wealth, and that so outside the scope of what they're thinking about. So how do you get a family to start thinking about generational wealth, and then what are those resources out there to help them do that?
It's difficult. As I said earlier, it's a scary word, especially when, like you say, they're in survival mode, right? And we've all gone through that. You wake up, you run, and you go to sleep. And to ask someone to take a time out of that, not just to mentally grasp the concept, but to literally put money aside, it's a difficult conversation, and it is something that the community leaders need to get better at delivering that message. First and foremost, you got to remember, we're in America, right? Capitalism. We go, we spend, we go, we spend. And we need to get rid of the scary words like generational wealth. And like when people of need come to me for services, the first thing I ask, all right, come on in and bring your budget. It's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek thing to say, but we always say that, all right, bring your budget with you. And they're like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
I was like, your budget of how you spend your money. You told me you made some money. I want to know how you spend it and how we're going to save it. And unfortunately, they look at me like if I ask them if they painted the Mona Lisa. Like it's just like not in their world. But that's one example of about 10 things that we can all do. And we actually do mentally, but when we put it on paper, we kind of hold ourselves a bit more responsible. We can all do that to help. Earlier we talked about income and getting that surplus. The surplus doesn't come without discipline.
Sure.
Right? So once we have the discipline in place, and there are vehicles that we'll get to, we can really grow that. Now, the biggest problem with saving so that we can help our kids and our grandkids, you know, have the resources that everybody else wants, is the mindset issue. I'm going to keep going off of mindset. When I ask someone, hey, are you ready to put some money away? They immediately throw out an absurd number. Well, I don't have $50,000. And I'm like, okay, who said $50,000, right? Well, I don't have 20. that's not real investing. That's unfortunately what they see on clips. You know, just in our generation, everyone wants to win the Powerball and retire. It's really not. And I was like, you don't have $50,000. You have $10. And again, I'm a bit standoffish. I feel since I understand the concept, it's my obligation to be of a bit of a thorn in their side, right? In American culture, it's one big check and I'll be set for life. Investing goes on all around the world. And I always go back to, and believe it or not, I need more hobbies, but how they invest in Southeast Asia is there's literally, they teach in schools, there's a huge stream. And they say, okay, we need to redirect that, the stream being your financial obligations and needs in life. And they tell the kids, and then one day you're gonna put a pebble in that stream. So you have this massive water force, and then in day 2, you put another pebble, and 3, and over the course of the year, you have 300 pebbles, and then it turns into 1,000 and 10,000, and we can reshape the way our water is moving if we're patient and diligent. And that's why you hear a lot of the kids now are hearing about these 529 college saving plans. Great thing. Will it pay for college? I don't know, right? Does it hurt? No. So we can put in 10 bucks, we could put in 20 bucks, and part of the byproduct of this conversation we're talking about is kids start thinking. You know, they start thinking, wow, I have a 529 plan, and this is not a joke. Again, this is not an accounting joke. I went to a 529 party for an 8-year-old in 21 after COVID, and the mom said he's got plenty of toys. Everybody contribute to it, and it didn't have to be a lot of money. Again, 5 bucks, 10 bucks, 20 bucks, those were the options. And we're driving to school, and my kid's like, wait a minute, he's going to college? And right there, I was like, man, now my kid's thinking about college, and that kid's thinking about college. And everybody's kind of getting in the same mindset that it's something we can do, right? Because like she was saying, some of these words are so unattainable. It's just not realistic to sit down and say, hey, do you need generational wealth, and walk away. We need the time and the energy to plant the seed in the parents, plant the seed in the kids, and we can get there. If not, get there in day 1 over the course of time, and maybe even generations, which is fine, which is a lot of how we got here. We'll get there eventually.
Yeah, I keep hearing the terms patience and discipline, patience and discipline. Stephanie, we talk a lot on this series about lived experience and leaders having lived experience. Yourself, can you talk a little about how your lived experience can help, you know, shape this conversation around building generational wealth and what you've learned?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we all come to it with our own lived experiences, and why education is so important to me is because of what my parents taught me. You know, my parents are first generation immigrants. They came with the clothes on their backs, and that's what they had. They did not have access to generational wealth and resources. My parents grew up in extreme poverty in Mexico, and were able to build wealth here in this country. My dad is an entrepreneur, and I feel like through a lot of folks in our community, like, you know, there's always a little side hustle that they work, and that ended up turning into my dad's full-time business now. And so I have access, our family's circumstances have dramatically changed over my lifetime because of my father's commitment to building wealth for our family here in this country. And I think it does start with, you know, I even remember conversations that I had. For me, it was the importance of getting an education. Education was what my parents showed me, that it was my path out of poverty. It was not negotiable. You're going to college, right? And when college got hard, it's not negotiable. You can't come back to Yuma. That was my response from my mom. Sorry, I don't know what to tell you. Figure it out. You gotta finish college. You know, so it is a little bit of that tough love and that straight talk. But now we're having different conversations as families, as our family unit, and that lived experience and how we show up, I think it matters, because now I can have different conversations with the families that we serve through All in Ed, right? Because I do have an immigrant story. My family is a family of immigrants, right? I can relate to and connect with our community in ways that others might not be able to. And I think that's the power that you all have too. It's the stories that we bring, the experiences and the perspectives that we bring to our work that will allow us, hopefully, to have different conversations and expand the mindsets and the thinking of the communities that we're serving.
Well, as we do on each episode of Paque Sepas, as we've been having this conversation around generational wealth, it's time for that call to action. And Stephanie, we'll start with you. The call to action for the community leaders out there, the education leaders, the social change leaders. We've been sort of sprinkling some of those calls to action throughout this conversation, but Stephanie, help us with what yours would be for this conversation.
You know, I'm coming off of an incredible testimonial from one of our parents who shared her story. And you mentioned the importance of our community having access to confidence. And what she said to us, you know, if it wasn't for you guys believing in me, as long as you guys believe in me, I can do anything. I can go up to the president of the United States and ask for more resources. I'm going to start crying too, because it was so powerful to hear from our families who just need somebody to believe in them. And so my call to action today is like, believe in the talent and potential of our community, because we are resilient, but we're tired of being resilient. We need access to opportunity. So believe in us and invest in us.
Appreciate you sharing that too. Ruger, we'll go to you now, and then we'll let you compose yourself, and then we'll have your call to action.
I cry and I feel, and I've seen these circumstances, so. Yeah.
Ruger, your call to action here as we're talking about generational wealth. Bring us home.
Sure. So the first step is financial literacy. And I see this as a wonderful thing, because I do think our community is great at financial literacy. They just do it on a day-to-day basis. It's not exactly textbook. We just need to do a better job about talking about it amongst our peers. It's not taboo. And we're talking about some people making less than others. I see it all the time because I see their W-2s. And I asked, have you asked your buddy what he makes? They're like, well, you know, it's his business. It is his business, but we all have the right to know, right? And you have to want to know. Saving money is like starting a diet or exercising, going for a walk every morning. Once you take that first step, you reap all the benefits. It's challenging though, and saving money, we have to reinforce it, because people do feel they're at wit's end and they're barely making ends meet. But I always say, if we can do this with our kids, it's an activity. You're going to the store, my kids pay for it. We go to the supermarket, I give them the card. And I'm like, is the receipt right? And they're 8 years old, and they're trying to look at numbers and figure it out. And what may seem a chore to them, they pick it up. These kids, like she said, they're so resilient and so smart. We just gotta take a step back, take a deep breath, and say, is this a learning moment regarding finances? Because it is the game of money in this country, and that's good. And our kids, even without a lot of money, need to know how to manage it to their benefit.
Okay, Yvonne, it's your turn.
Yeah,
call to action
I'm
for
a
our
little
community
composed.
leaders. Yeah, no, I appreciate you guys sharing that story too. What was your call to action?
Well, and I think just listening to that story, I saw what my parents went through, and the fact that just that entrepreneurial mindset, that it's all about working hard. And sometimes when you are in a situation where you may not be making a lot of money and that you're low income, it's finding a way out. It's having exposure to different resources that are out there. As Ruger mentioned, financial education is essential, because most people don't have even knowledge. I remember assisting with the volunteer income tax assistance. Most people would use their refunds to go on a vacation instead of investing that in a small savings account, or being able to invest it in whether it's education or any other asset. But at the end of the day, it is finding that confidence and believing in these people that they can also become financially independent. And it's also going to be not only affect education, but businesses and housing, and potentially address the homeless issue that we're having, and having people purchase more homes than becoming renters living on a day-to-day. So I think it's a matter of believing, and a matter of having access to the financial resources and education that's out there.
Well, thank you all for sharing that. And we thank you guys for watching this edition of PACE Sepas, the Social Determinants of Education. As a reminder, we will continue building on the conversation every single month, bringing you a deep dive conversation around each of the topics. So again, thank you to Stephanie, Ruger, and Yvonne for sharing your knowledge on this topic. And of course, All in Education would like to thank their sponsor for helping make these conversations possible. Stephanie, I know you want to thank the Garcia family.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. The Garcia Family Foundation is the reason why we're able to put this show on, so we are incredibly grateful for their continued support.
Absolutely. And we thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next month.